Okay. Here you go. Thank you.
She does 45 minutes.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's League of Women Voters event, and also welcome to spring. It's so nice out there. But what we're going to talk about tonight is what's going to be happening next spring. That's the Census 2020 and why it's important. I'm Colleen Feige, the president of the League of Women Voters, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for tonight. Andrew Verdon is the Director of Census Operations and Engagement for the Minnesota State Demographic Center. Is that correct? I thought so. Thank you for that. He received his master's degree in public affairs with a concentration in leadership and management from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the U. And he received his bachelor's degree previous to that at Macalester in St. Paul. Also tonight we have Sheila Bjorklund is going to be doing the moderating, and you were given cards when you came in. If you have any questions you want to ask, please write them down on those cards, and we'll have people around picking up those questions and distributing cards as well if there's more questions. Then we'll have the question sorters give them to the moderator who will ask the questions. This is the way the league does it, and it really works quite efficiently. So with that, Andrew, are you mic'd? Okay.
Can you hear me?
And thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me back. I was joking earlier that my boss, Susan Brower, has a much more busy speaking engagements than I because she's nice. And she gets invited for repeat visits. I usually don't. But I was speaking with a smaller group of the League of Women Voters in Edina just 2 weeks ago. And I guess it went okay because they did invite me back. So that's good. So a little adjustment to the way I usually do this presentation. So first of all, I usually take questions as we go, but I understand this format, and I think this works just fine. So please write down your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So my name is Andrew Verdon, and I am the Director of Census Operations and Engagement. I work for the state of Minnesota. In 2010, I worked on the census itself. So I have a background in 2010, I worked in recruiting for the Census Bureau. And then I worked in field operations. So I have an experience in both trying to recruit the workers to come work for the census, and then I was in charge of the workers actually doing the counting. I had some 190 people that I was responsible for at the time in the largest district in the state of Minnesota. My district was in Minneapolis, included Loring Park, Downtown East, Downtown West, the University of Minnesota. So very diverse in all senses of the word. Economically, culturally, linguistically, and my district after April 1st had some 13,000, almost 500 individual addresses where we had not collected a form. So my job was dispatching those 191 people to go out and collect those forms. So great. With that, let's start. I think it's important anytime we're doing a conversation like this, when I do conversations like this around the state, is to start with kind of some foundational information, because some people in the room, this will be their first census. Others will be like, oh, this is my 5th census. I worked on 4 of them, right? And so I'm trying to navigate that so as not to bore the experts or talk over the heads of the novices. So let's talk a little history of the census. So first of all, it's been around since 1790, and it's in the Constitution. I used to actually carry around a little pocket Constitution book with me when I was doing census work in 2010. And so when I would have a concierge in one of the very fancy buildings in downtown Minneapolis tell me that they weren't going to let me into their building, I would say, well, my job is in the Constitution. Can you find concierge? That wasn't always well received, but it sounded good in my head when I thought of it. So from 1970 to 2000, there was what was known as both a short form and a long form. So the long form, by show of hands, how many people in this room have had the long form before? Okay, so we've got a handful. So they're not kidding when they call it the long form. It really was long. I mean, it asked lots of, I think what most of us would agree were some more maybe intrusive questions. How many rooms do you have? How many bathrooms do you have? How many toilets do you have? What degree do you have? How much money do you make? Right? So a lot more kind of personal type questions. Well, starting in 2010, they went to what was called the short form, and that meant that all people got just the short form, which is only 10 questions long. We'll talk a little later about what that form looked like. Now you can see there's a little asterisk next to that 10 questions. It's because in the 2020 form, the form is expected to be 10 questions. There's this kind of thorny 11th question that may be added, which we'll have a chance to talk about as well. As indicated here, so the 2020 form has not yet been finalized, but most expect it'll be similar to the 2010 in length. So the one question that is new to the 2020 form is one having to deal with citizenship. That is a question that has not been asked since 1950, and it is now suddenly back on there. And there's certain problems with that, given that this is a nonpartisan organization, and I am a nonpartisan person. As I work for the state of Minnesota, I'll simply tell you what my boss, the state demographer, says about that, which is if certain people are concerned about answering a question, then might that cause us to have gaps in our knowledge about certain segments of the population, right? Bad data means it's I'll put it another way. It's hard to make good policy decisions if you have bad data. And if you have certain segments of the population which are concerned about filling out a question on the form, then it's going to be very tough in order for us to be able to serve them. Now, that applies whether we're government, federal government, state government, county government, city government, community-based organizations, faith-based groups, business groups. Lots of different people have cause to use the census and census data. And if we have certain blind spots, shall we say, about our population, it's going to make it very difficult for us to get good data. So here's a sample form from 2010. It's interesting. So as I said, you know, that long form asks a lot more kind of personal type questions. How many toilets do you have? What kind of education do you have? How much money do you make? Right? The 2010 form was pretty simple, actually. It asked questions like, how many people lived at this residence on April 1st? What's the relationship of the person who's filling out the form to the other people who live at this residence? What's their sex? Are they Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? What's their race? Do you rent or own your home? So most of those questions aren't very personal. They're, frankly, if you were an enumerator and you were trying to collect the information from my household, you could probably answer my form without ever having to speak with me. In fact, the form is designed to work that way. So if a respondent, if the person who lives at the address does not answer the form, the enumerator, the door knocker, can actually go to a neighbor, can go to the mail person, can say, hey, what do you know about the person who lives in apartment 102? Right? And so it's possible that that neighbor, maybe they live on the 5th floor in the basement or live across the cul-de-sac or is brand new to the neighborhood, they might be able to answer some questions about you, but they wouldn't know others. For example, one's name. Right? So they might just know, it's a loud Brazilian guy. I think he's in his 40s. He likes soccer. He's got a cat named Nuts. Like, I know a lot of this other stuff about him, but maybe I don't know his name. Okay, that's fine. I'm not offended. So most of this information is not that private. Now, you could make a case about the question about citizenship, which is to say, what is the context that you would know what someone else's citizenship is, right? I live in a building of 19 units in South Minneapolis. I only know the citizenship of one person who lives in my building, myself, right? What's the context in which I would ask the citizenship of someone else who lived in my building? Hello, fellow American. How did you fill out your NCAA bracket this year? Hello, American. Are you going to opening day today? Fellow American, what do you think of that snowstorm last week? It doesn't come up. What's the context, right?
Voting.
What's that?
Voting.
Voting?
Election judge.
Yeah, right? But I might ask someone, are you planning on voting today? But I wouldn't say, are you an American? And then I'd say, okay, are you voting? I just ask people, are you planning on voting, right? So here's some broad information about how the census works. So starting in July of 2017 through April of last year, April of 2018, there's an operation known as the Local Update of Census Addresses, or LUCA. What that means is the Census Bureau sends to the state of Minnesota a list of all known addresses in the state of Minnesota. My office, the State Demographer's Office, got that file, and then we shared that with the counties, and we shared that with the cities. And we said, please verify, are these all the addresses in Hennepin County? Are these all the addresses in Edina? And then Edina responded, and Hennepin County responded, and they say, well, no, actually, you forgot about this. There's a new development over here off of Highway 100 you're not aware of, or that used to be single-family homes, and now they're putting in apartments, right? So the good news is we had a 100% participation rate in the state of Minnesota for LUCA. That's great. What that means is that all cities and counties either participated or we were able to cover them. And the counties that did not participate in it wasn't because of ideological reasons, it was because of simply manpower or people power. They said, well, we don't have someone who can do all of that work. So we, the state, took that work up. The good news is because of the participation rate, we collectively, we found 90,000 addresses that the Census Bureau did not know existed. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? Well, because the census form is sent to every address where people live. Had the Census Bureau not known about those 90,000 addresses, then that's 90,000 addresses that wouldn't have gotten the form, and they wouldn't have had the opportunity to fill out their census form. It could be really, really problematic. There's an interesting article about a particular block in New York City that got missed in the 2010 census. There's literally like thousands of people that got missed because the Census Bureau didn't know that that particular block existed. So we want to avoid that from happening. So starting in January of last year, the cities and counties began forming what's known as complete count committees all over the state. Good news is the state of Minnesota right now is up to over 100 complete count committees all over the state, including here in Edina. And Edina is doing some great work on that. And so I hope we'll have an opportunity to talk about that a little more later. The state of Minnesota also has a complete count committee for the first time ever. That's not something that we did in 2010, but it's something that we thought was important. So what is the role of a complete count committee? Essentially, their job is to take what the federal plan to make sure they count every man, woman, and child in the country is and to localize it. Right? So we, the state of Minnesota, are trying to localize this plan and make it Minnesotan. Hennepin County is trying to make it Hennepin County. And Edina is trying to make sure that it's Edina. Right? Someone said, what exactly does that mean when you're trying to make it, make the Census Bureau's plan in Minnesota? I said, I don't know, maybe we put it on a stick or deep fry it and serve it at the state fair. That's great. That's really, really terrific. In 2010, there were approximately 300 complete count committees across the state of Minnesota. So the fact that we're a third of the way there with more than a year to go, I think is terrific. And I think it bodes well for our chances. So in April of last year, the questions were delivered to Congress, including the citizenship question. That was a question that was added 5 days before the deadline. And then the testing began. So the Census Bureau does tests every 2 years before the census, and they're supposed to test all of the elements of their new census, including new software, new questions, etc., new technology. The citizenship question, unfortunately, was not included in that test. So when the Census Bureau says with a straight face to Congress that we don't believe that the citizenship question is going to have a detrimental effect on response rates, my question, I think, is a fair one. Based on what? That's like me saying, you know, I think I'm going to pitch a perfect inning for the Twins, a perfect game for the Twins this weekend. Really? Based on what? So I think it's a fair question. And so that's something that's going to be resolved by the Supreme Court this summer. In July of this year, the Census Bureau itself is going to begin its communications and advertising campaign. And in 1 year from Monday, which will be Wednesday, April 1st of 2020, will be Census Day. And so that's the day upon which all of this is based. And then after some time, if people still don't respond to the various postcards and letters and forms and such they get from the Census Bureau, then the Census Bureau will begin sending enumerators or door knockers to the door to try to collect that information. That's a period which is known as non-response follow-up, or NARFU. If you like acronyms, you love the Census Bureau. NARFU. Sounds like an insult. So let's talk about what some of the challenges facing the 2020 census are. So keep in mind that these are not unique to the 2020 census. Some of these may be new, some of these may be more exacerbated now. So I just want to highlight a couple of them. The first being a constrained fiscal environment. Now that's something that's both on a federal level. So the federal government, as you may know, last year, the government agencies, including the Census Bureau, was operating on a series of continuing resolutions. So where they weren't allowed to spend more money, they had to operate in the same amount of money for months. In fact, I believe it was 7 months into the fiscal year before the Census Bureau finally got funded. The good news is they did get funded at that point, but anyone who's ever built a house before, it's nice to have the money before you start building the house as opposed to get an influx of money halfway through. Right? I say this as an apartment owner, that's why I don't build houses. We also have, there's an explosion of information in 2020. Think about where we were back in 2010 in terms of social media. Wasn't as prevalent, right? Phones, more likely to have a flip phone than say a smartphone or what have you. With that information explosion also comes a disinformation explosion, right? Lots of false, it feels like false things move through the internet a lot faster than the truth. And so that's certainly a concern for the 2010 census as well. We want to make sure that accurate information is being disseminated to people. And they're not getting incorrect information about, you know, are there any ramifications for me filling this out or for not filling this out? Or might I get in trouble with the government if I answer a question a particular way? Is that going to cause harm to me and my family or my neighbors, right? So that's important. Distrust in government is also nothing new. That has been an issue in all parts of the country and all parts of the state for a long time. As I said, I worked in 2010 for the census, and there were people in 2010 who said, I don't want the government knowing who I am and where I live. I found that a little amusing when that person lived in, say, Minneapolis and had an apartment and a car and a cell phone and such. It was like, maybe you're not quite as incognito as you might think. In the United States, in Minnesota, in Hennepin County, we have an increasingly diverse population, which I think is a strength of our country. But it also means we have a lot more challenges trying to reach diverse populations who historically have been undercounted. So I want to give you an example of why this is challenging. So the Census Bureau supports 13 languages. 13 languages. It includes English, includes German, Russian, Mandarin, Chinese, Portuguese, Polish, Korean. It's great if you speak one of those languages. But there are 3 languages that are spoken here in Minnesota which are not covered by the census. Those include Somali, Hmong, and Oromo. Yep, 3 languages which are pretty important to us. And those languages are not supported by the Census Bureau. When I say not supported, what that means is you can't get a census form in Somali. You can't go online and fill out your form in Somali. And you can't call the toll-free number and ask to speak to an agent in Somali and provide your information over the phone. So it's great news that there is now an internet option. And it's great news that there is a phone option if you speak one of those 13 languages. If you don't, it's problematic. So we'll talk a little bit about what we're doing to try to combat that. So one other thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that right now we have a lot of people living in informal, complex living arrangements. People say, well, what does that mean? I guess the way I think about it is like a bunch of college bros, right? A bunch of 24-year-old smelly dudes. They lived together after college, right? They went to high school together, they came back to Minnesota, and they're all living in this house together. And sorry for any dudes and bros in the crowd, but you know, being one myself, I feel like that's a group I can pick on. When that census form arrives at that household of college bros, who's taking responsibility to answer to fill out the census form? Hold on, no, I got it. No, I got it. I want to be the one to fill out the government form this time. You had the last one, right? No, we got college bros have other priorities, like what's for dinner, where are we getting pizza from? Like, can we go out and get wings tonight, right? Other things. So that's a challenge as well. But it also means, you know, say if a child, well, frankly, a lot of different situations. Frankly, people experiencing homelessness. Right? Someone who might not have a permanent address. That's a particular challenge for the Census Bureau, for people who are unsheltered. You know, if you are staying at, say, Salvation Army Harbor Lights in downtown Minneapolis, you're more likely to be counted by the Census Bureau, because the Census Bureau has a whole operation whose job it is to go to the shelters in order to collect that information, right? The problem is if, let's say, a family or an individual happens to be staying with friends and moving back and forth, couch surfing as the kids call it, right? Who counts that person? There's another group which is historically undercounted and does very poorly on the census, and that's children under 5. When I first heard that, I thought maybe this was like a Home Alone situation, right? Like, family goes off and little Kevin's left at home to fight off the burglars, and the family's in Paris. That's not actually the case. What's interesting is that kids under 5 who get missed by the census, 80% of them live in households where the household filled out the form. So I don't know what that means. I don't know what the basis for that is. I've heard some speculation that says, well, maybe it's a situation where the parents are divorced, and so, you know, the mother is saying, I thought your dad put you on the form, and the mom said, I thought, you know, and vice versa, right? And maybe the parents aren't communicating about that particular issue at that time, right? So this is important. Census. Anything that you tell the census, anything that identifies you as an individual when you fill out your form in the census is confidential. And it's confidential for 72 years. Does anyone know why your information would be, why 72 years? Why is that number? Life expectancy, exactly. So the thought is by the time the information is released, you won't be around to care. You won't care whether that information has been released or not. So, for example, the 2020 census, that information is not being released until the year 2092. And there's a reason for that, and that is that was not always the case with the Census Bureau. In fact, in the 1940s, census information was used by the federal government in order to identify Japanese American neighborhoods so that internment was possible, so that Americans could be put in prison camps for the duration of the war. And so as in the 1950s, the decision was made, you know what, we need to make this confidential. We need to protect people, because if we want people to be honest and fulsome in filling out their census form, we need to make sure that people don't feel like some harm might come of them by filling out that form honestly. So that means that the information can't be shared with any level of government. We're talking about federal government, state government, county government, city government. Can't go to the IRS, can't go to the FBI, can't go to the Department of Revenue, can't go to welfare, can't go to ICE. No level of government can know that information. In fact, the President of the United States himself, President Barack Obama, President Donald Trump can't get that information about that particular household. And I think that's important to know. Now, I will grant you this. If you don't trust the government, you don't trust when the government tells you, trust me, it's confidential for 72 years. I'll grant you that. But it's important when I feel it's important when I get an opportunity to speak to groups like this to let you know what the truth is. Because the fact is that people aren't going to trust me. If I just meet someone in the street like, hey, did you know your information is confidential for 72 years? Like, wow, that was really weird. Why are you telling me that, right? However, someone in your social network, be that your work, your school, faith organization, kids karate practice or whatnot, that the person is more likely to trust you because they know you. You're a fellow congregant, you're a fellow karate aficionado. And so they're going to trust, they're more likely to trust you than this weird guy walking around Edina telling people your information is confidential. So also important to know is that the Census Bureau employees themselves take your confidentiality very, very seriously. They are sworn to life. They are sworn to secrecy for life for any information that they gather about you or particular residents. And the penalty for violating that is 5 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. This is a job that pays $20 an hour in Hennepin County. What are the chances that you want to divulge some really sweet information that you just got about this house on the corner if it means 5 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine? I'd say not very high. Lastly, the Census Bureau is very, very airtight technology in order to protect your answers. So, to me, census is about three things. One, it's about power. It's about political power on the federal level, on the state level, on the county level, on the city level. It's about money, money that comes from Washington, D.C. to the state of Minnesota. It's about money that comes from St. Paul to Edina. It's about money that comes from Hennepin County. And it's about data. We'll talk about more of these. We'll talk about these in greater depth. Here's a map of the 2010 congressional reapportionment. So this is following the 2010 census. The states in gray are those which maintained their number of congresspeople. The states in, I guess that's like a burnt orange kind of deal, are the states which lost congressional seats. And the states in blue are those which gained. What do the seats in blue have in common? Where are they located, largely? In the South, right? With the exception of Washington State. What's going on up in Washington State which might be driving people up there? Google, technology, Microsoft, jobs, right? So you have most of the states where you have loss of population tend to be where? In the north, tend to be cold in those states, except for Louisiana. Look at Louisiana there with the 6 on it next to Texas. What happened in Louisiana before the 2010 census, which might have caused a massive and sudden Hurricane Katrina? Correct. And so that was to the gain of Texas, shown with a 36, Georgia at 14, and Florida with a 27. So the good news is Minnesota kept its 8th congressional seat. Minnesota has had 8 or more congresspeople for 100 years. For 100 years. That's incredible. There are 435 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. Minnesota got the 435th of those seats. Does anyone know the margin by which Minnesota held on to its 8th congressional seat? Under 10,000. 8,739 to be precise. That's a number that keeps me awake at night. Had we 8,740 fewer noses counted in Minnesota, Missouri would be gray and Minnesota would be orange. So the good news is, at least in 2010, we were able to hold on to our 8th congressional seat. The bad news is we're on the cusp once again. Minnesota, the Census Bureau issues population estimates every year, and the last time this was done last year, They say that Minnesota will either barely hold on or we will lose our seat by as few as 10 to 30,000 people. Which means we're right back where we were in 2010. Minnesota historically does very well with respect to census participation, as we do with a lot of measures of civic engagement. In fact, we were number 2 in census participation, following only our dear rivals to the east, Wisconsin. They beat us by less than 1%, but this time we are going to beat Wisconsin. It might kill me, but we will beat Wisconsin. So it's I don't know, I guess I do take it. I was going to say, it's not that important we beat Wisconsin, but actually it is. We are going to beat Wisconsin. So here we have a list of the states which are expected to gain a seat in the left-hand column, and the seats, and on the right-hand column are those which are expected to lose. This is really interesting. When I started my job last April, first week on the job, I went to a Census Bureau conference in Providence, Rhode Island, which is, interestingly, where they were running the test of the 2020 census. And we had a moderated discussion, and we're going around the room, and I was representing Minnesota, and the moderator says, how do you describe success for the 2020 census? He went from table to table and asked everyone at the table to stand up and speak into the microphone. And I think I did say beat Wisconsin. The person next to me was from Illinois, and he said, my vision of success is that we only lose 1 seat and not 2. Because that's how bad things are in Illinois right now. So, yeah, let's not do that. So what are the ramifications of getting the count wrong or losing a congressional seat? I do this, a variation of this speech all over the state, as does my boss, Susan Brower. Last fall, I said, what if we lost a congressperson? Some smart aleck in the back row raised his hand and he says, well, you can have mine. The fact of the matter is that it is important how many congresspeople we have. And here's a representation of what would happen if Minnesota was to lose a congressional seat. If instead of 8 seats we had 7, that would mean that each seat would gain approximately 105 to 110,000 people. That means an already huge district like the 7th Congressional District out there to the west of Minnesota, which already goes from practically the Canadian border to the Iowa border, grows even more. Because there aren't a lot of cities in that part of the state. In fact, there aren't any cities in that part of the state that has an extra 105, 110,000 to gain, which means you have to gain a lot of real estate in order to do that. Now, I submit to you that I don't think that's fair if you happen to live at the southern end of that district and you need to drive all the way up to Fargo because you're trying to talk to your congressperson because you're trying to bring a spouse here to Minnesota, or your kid needs a passport or something along those lines. It only makes you further away from the government that's supposed to serve you. So that's important. Also, ramifications for us about political representation on the state level as well. Of course, the purpose here is to make sure that all districts are approximately the same size, because each representative is supposed to represent approximately the same number of people. Well, this is a map of the state legislative districts. I'm going to talk about our friends here in Aiken County. They have already a huge district. And Aiken County is losing population, right? Because there are more deaths and births, and you have more people leaving than are coming into Aiken County. What that means for Aiken County in this situation is if their population continues to drop, or they have an undercount, that means that what is already a very large district becomes even larger. Now, those of us here in the metro area, our districts might get smaller because we're getting more and more dense. To me, this is the headline. This is what matters. And these are updated numbers. So census counts guides the distribution of dollars from Washington, D.C. At stake, Minnesota gets $15 billion a year from the federal government that comes to us on the basis of the decennial census count. $15 billion. You break that down on a per capita basis, that's almost $2,800 per man, woman, and child, $2,796 to be precise. That means that and because we only do the census once every 10 years, that means it's about $28,000 per person in federal funds. Now keep in mind the state of Minnesota doesn't do its own census, so St. Paul also relies on these numbers. So there's more money that comes to, Hennepin County on the basis of the decennial census count. More money comes to Edina on the basis of decennial census count. So that $2,796 that's just the federal money. There's state money as well, and there's money that comes from the county as well. Here are some examples of what that money pays for. On the federal side, you have Medicaid, you have highway planning, there's SNAP, there's Medicare Part B, Section 8 housing. State examples include local government aid, community education funding, small cities development grants, and trunk highway funds. All things that we need. So this is the challenge of the census, not unique to 2020, but a challenge nonetheless. We want to make sure we count everyone once. We want to count them only once. We want to make sure we count them in the right place. Easier said than done. So I want to talk to you about the areas where we have the most opportunity for improvement. Those are in areas what the census calls a hard to count tract. That means so a census tract is a small area, it's a subdivision of a county, right? And they are areas with a low response score. So in 2010, that meant it was an area that had a response score of less than 73%, which is what the national average for the response rate was. And then if there was someone at a particular residence who did not respond, they'd send enumerators. They'll send enumerators everywhere, but there are certain areas where that's more prevalent than others. In Edina, it happens to be the apartments over by Southdale Mall, just south of Southdale Mall. So when the Edina Complete Count Committee is focusing their work and trying to think, well, where do we need to go? That's an area where you need to focus on. 2 weeks ago, when I gave this similar presentation with Joni, we took a look at that map to get an idea of exactly where we want to spend our limited resources and our limited time. We know that that's an area where we need help, even here in Edina. Here are some characteristics which make an area hard to count. I want to be clear about that. We're talking about areas, not people. These are characteristics of an area that makes it hard to count. Places with vacant units, multi-family housing units, so like apartment buildings are particularly tough. Renters, in fact, out of this entire list and out of all the list of all the characteristics which might make an area hard to count, high percentage of renters is number one, far and above race, income, age, any other characteristic. And why that is because renters tend to also have those other characteristics. They tend to be less affluent. They tend to be more diverse. And they tend to be more mobile, right? So I don't have the figures here, but it's pretty staggering. I believe the percentage of foreign-born people in Minnesota, something like 46% are renters. Right? Communities of color, that number is north of 40%. So it's very, very important. So if you have an occupied unit where you have more than 1.5 people living per room, households where you don't have a husband and wife living together, we can go back to my college bros that I was talking about before. Occupied units where you don't have a landline, adults who don't have a high school diploma, people living in poverty, people on public assistance, people who are experiencing unemployment, linguistically isolated households. What that means is it's a household where you don't have someone over the age of 13 who speaks English fluently. and places where occupied units where households recently moved into the unit. So those, going back to number 11, linguistically isolated households, that includes those, you know, if the Census Bureau itself is not sending out the forms in Somali, Oromo, or Hmong, are we surprised that households which speak those languages don't respond to something that does not speak to them? Absolutely not. So, what can you do to help the 2020 census? Number one, make sure you fill out your own form, right? Like that's like base level. That's the least you could do. It's like literally the least you could do, fill out your own form. But you can also help encourage others to fill out their form. And that could be people in your social network. It could be people at work, school, church, what have you. Help others to fill out their forms. I brought this up to the League of Women Voters, to this chapter, when we met 2 weeks ago. There may be a role for a nonpartisan organization that's recognized and trusted, like the League of Women Voters, to say, how can we help other people fill out their forms? And maybe that's here at City Hall, or maybe it's at the library, or maybe it's at Cub Foods, or at Target, or other places where you could set up a table, just like the League of Women Voters does around election time every year. Say, hey, have you registered to vote? Or the Edina 4th of July festival, where you get people to come sign up. You could absolutely have an opportunity to get people to sign, to complete their census forms. Again, we mentioned that, I mentioned the online form. As long as you have a web-enabled tablet or laptop or computer, or frankly even phone, you can help someone else fill out their form right there. And you don't have to be a Census Bureau worker in order to be able to do that. All you need is the URL in order to be able to help the person get to that spot. You can work for the Census Bureau as an office or field staff. This is an important one. The Census Bureau for peak operations, which means for March, April, May, June of next year, is going to need approximately 7,500 employees for the state of Minnesota. In order for them to get 7,500 employees, that means they're going to need to recruit approximately 40,000 applicants. 40,000 sounds like a lot, right? You know, in Minnesota right now, or last I heard, I've been gone for a couple months, but the last I heard, Minnesota only has 90,000 people who are actively looking for work. That means you need to get approximately half of all people looking for a job to look for a job with the Census Bureau. What are the chances that that's going to happen? There's going to be a skills mismatch, and there's also going to be a spatial mismatch. I'm an out-of-work dentist. Maybe I don't want to work for the Census Bureau, right? Or maybe I happen to live in an affluent area of town where, you know what, the Census Bureau doesn't need a lot of help filling out those forms. But in some of those harder-to-count areas, they need a lot of help. So what that means is that this is a great job, whether you are a college student, whether you are retired, whether you are semi-retired, whether you are staying at home because you're caring for someone, or you're simply not looking for full-time work, but you would like something where you can work flexible hours. I mean, to me, this is as good. Well, actually, I would say it's actually a lot better than driving for Uber or delivering pizzas. Because there's a civic component to this as well. When I was describing this job to someone once, they said it sounds like a paid volunteer job. That's an interesting oxymoron, but I think I get what they're talking about. Because a volunteer job is something you do because you love it. I volunteer with the League of Women Voters because I'm passionate about democracy and I'm passionate about voting. But you don't get paid to do that. But this is a paid volunteer position because it's something that helps your own neighborhood. So, very important. You can, if you are not interested in a job yourself, you can tell others to work for the Census Bureau. You can encourage other people to work for the Census Bureau. I think in an economy where the unemployment rate in the state of Minnesota is under 3%, I think it's going to be very difficult for the Census Bureau to find enough qualified workers who are willing and able to do this work. Because on my way from Minneapolis today, actually my way from St. Paul today, I probably passed hundreds of businesses that had help wanted signs in the window. And if I wanted a job, I could go to Shake Shack right now. I could get an interview tonight. I bet I'd be started by this weekend. So that's going to be challenging for us. You can join your local complete count committee in order to help increase awareness and participation in the 2020 census. I mentioned this before. Edina already has a complete count committee formed. I encourage, and some members may be in this room right now. If you are interested in participating, interested in helping out on the city level or with your complete count committee, I encourage you to do that. And if there's not a complete count committee in your area or in your interest group, or maybe you say, you know what, it's great that Edina has their own complete count committee, but I think my block needs one. My neighborhood needs its own complete count committee, because maybe there's some differentiation of where I live versus where you live that says that there's a reason why I want to form my own complete count committee, and we will certainly support that. So here's the information about jobs for the census. The application is pretty easy. It takes about half an hour to fill out. First 10 minutes or so is biographic information, name, address, age, etc. If you're male, you have to fill out whether or not you've completed the Federal Selective Service, and there's a link that'll give you that number, because you have to do that if you're a man. If you're going to work for the federal government, you have to have completed that. And then there's about 20 minutes of kind of situational questions. What do I mean by that? So there will be really tough questions like, my supervisor would describe me as really easy to get along with, kind of easy to get along with, sort of easy to get along with, a horrible human being. It's not an actual question, but it's not far. It's not far from it. I know that's a really tricky one. So I strongly encourage people to apply for these jobs because we're going to need the help. With that, my contact information is here, my email address, my phone numbers. If you think of questions, as I always do after a presentation like this at like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I mean, don't call me at that time, but you could send me an email at that time and I'll get back to you. With that, I'll stand for questions.
Andrew, we have a number of questions that are focusing in on that citizenship question. One of the questions is, why did they take the citizenship question out in 1950? And a corollary to that is, if the information is confidential for 73 years, information from the 1950 census would not yet be made public.
Right. So to the first question, I don't know why they took the citizenship question off. I don't know why they stopped asking the question. Now, the information that you give is private for 72 years, but they're still able to release that information, right, in the aggregate. So they can release information about your census tract. They can't say Andrew Verdon lives at this address, but they can say, so I live in the Stevens Square neighborhood in Minneapolis, and they could say per the 2020 census, there's 9,763 people who live in that neighborhood, 32% of whom are African or African American descent. 7% are children under 5. So information about my neighborhood as a whole can be released, but no information about me specifically can be released. Now, the fear that people have about this particular question is, even if the information about me specifically isn't released, might that information still be able to be used by the government to say, that's an area where there's a large Latino or Hispanic or Spanish-speaking people live in this neighborhood, so I'm afraid of providing my information. So it's a real challenging question. Now, the Supreme Court will be rendering their decision this summer about whether or not the question is legal, whether the question can be included on the form. Now, whether or not the question is on the form is obviously out of my hands. But there's a question about, even if the question is on the form, would it be a mandatory question, right? And it's pure speculation on my part. I'll just tell you, in 2010, there was only 3 questions which were mandatory. It was the number of people in that household, their sex, and their age. The Census Bureau was able to collect those 3 pieces of information. The Census Bureau would consider that form complete. And so it was the hope that that the citizenship question would not be mandatory, right? Now, the Census Bureau will tell you that, yes, you are required to answer the entire form. Thing is, the Census Bureau is not a law enforcement agency, so they're not going to come around and they're not going to arrest you for not having completed your form, right? So I guess that's the good news. So what I tell people is that they should fill out as much of the form as they feel safe answering, or that they feel comfortable answering. Now, this technological response that the Census Bureau has, the fact that the form is now going to be available online, that might tell people which are the questions which are mandatory and which are not, in a way that a paper form wouldn't. Because the paper form didn't have a little asterisk on it to say you need to fill out these 3 questions and your form will be considered complete. But your computer might. Because might the computer allow you to tab past the questions which are not required and may not allow you to move forward if you don't, if a particular question is mandatory. At least that's the hope. So the good news is we still have some time before we'll know what the Supreme Court's decision is, and we'll have some further time to determine what our response to their response is going to be.
Someone else is wondering what was lost in doing away with the long form and going strictly with the short form?
Good question. I mean, I think I actually don't have any experience with the long form. So what was the long form, as I said, was in fact long and had a lot more information on it. So a select group of people still get what was the long form, except it's no longer the long form. It's called the American Community Survey. So if you've ever heard of that, so that is used. That's sent to a representative sample of households. I believe it's 1 in every 34 households or something receive the American Community Survey. So from that information, we're able to make declarations about the state of Minnesota to say income for women is up 7%. Income for communities of color is up 10%, or home ownership is down, or that type of information is able to be given, but that's only on the basis of a sample, so it's not as accurate as if you ask all of those same questions of the entire population.
Now there were some questions dealing with actual counting of individuals living in a particular household. This one question is, if a child lives with a guardian or relative other than a parent, who counts that child?
That's a great question. So the standard for the census is actually where do you spend the majority of your time. So if that child is with the guardian, non-parent, but the child is with that guardian for the majority of the time, then that guardian would put them down on their form.
Is that also true if a child lives with a foster parent?
Yes.
If you have, like here in Edina, we have the Edina ABC students who are living, it would be similar, I suppose, to like a college type of living situation where there are house parents, but they're not a guardian, they're not a foster parent. Who counts students such as the ABC students?
So I'm not familiar with the ABC program. I'd have to know a little bit more about that in order to answer the question accurately.
I believe, and so whomever asked the question.
They go to Edina High School.
Ah.
They're here for the school year.
Are they like exchange students?
Well, they're from the U.S.
Ah,
That's a better chance.
got it. I'll have to look into that, but I think they would count. I think they would count here if they're spending the majority of their time here. Then yes, they should count here. Now, situations like if someone's living in a dormitory, and that's a little different than living, in like a home like that. But like, let's say your child was was at the University of Minnesota and was staying in Middlebrook Hall. If your child is at Middlebrook Hall, that's where they should. That's where their form will be filled out. The good news is you don't have to rely on your child filling out their form in Middlebrook Hall, because that's something known as group quarters, and the Census Bureau has a whole process for that. So the Census Bureau will contact, Augsburg, University of Minnesota, McAllister, all the schools, and say, okay, who is living on-campus housing, and the school will fill out the information and say, this is the roster for Middlebrook Hall. So you don't have to worry about going door to door in Middlebrook Hall trying to get people to fill out that information. Now, where the challenge comes in is, are students living off campus? Right? Because that's not something that the school necessarily has or will release. Now, keep in mind, people have concerns about giving their information over. Keep in mind that it's not only about the government. Oftentimes people are more worried about the landlord finding out how many people actually live in that house than they are worried about the government, right? And so using that example of in Dinkytown, I guarantee you they're not all staying at the limit where they're supposed to be. Or in a situation where someone might be, let's say they're receiving public assistance, right? Sometimes they'll say, you cannot your household income cannot exceed this level. And so people might not fill out the form accurately because they're afraid, if you found out that my 2 adult children also live with me and you know that they also are working, then I'm going to lose my housing. Therefore, what's the lease say? Yeah, that's how many live here. Right? So that's a big challenge as well. So trying to get people to appreciate that, the interesting story. In December, I met with a Latinx church in South Minneapolis. And I was speaking with a young Latina, and she said, I wasn't a citizen in 2010, and I'm not a citizen now. She says, but I still know how important the census is. And so she says, I knew that my kids knew a bunch of other kids from different families who all lived in one particular house. And she's like, so I kept going back every weekend and getting more and more people to help fill out the form and fill out the form and fill out the form. She said that the final count was 53 individuals living in one house. 53 individuals. Different families in different rooms, unmarried men living in other rooms who were sleeping in shifts. 53 people in one house. And I will grant you, if I was the enumerator who came to that door and I knocked on that door persistently a number of times, would I have gotten 53? Probably not. I may not have gotten anyone to respond. So that speaks to the importance of having people who are from the community, who look like the people that they're trying to knock on, people who are at least culturally competent, if not linguistically competent, in order to be able to communicate. That's pretty amazing. 53 people in one household.
Going along that line of counting people who are living in congregate type of housing, how about senior citizens or people who are living in assisted living? How are they counted?
Another tricky situation. And I believe the question has to do with their level of independence. So my grandma, age 102, who lives in Sartell, she lives independently, so she'll get her own mail, right? But someone who, say, maybe lives in a memory care facility would not. So that would be a situation where the Census Bureau would contact the memory care facility and say, can we have a roster of the people that live here, and that information would be filled out for them. If it seems like I'm evading the question, it's only because it's very complicated. The Census Bureau's rules about this is not much of an exaggeration to say it's about the thickness of a phone book, to be able to look that situation up. Well, what if I'm abroad at the time, or I was in Cleveland on business and it was Tuesday, right? Like there's all these various scenarios where that might affect. If you're on, just to answer the question, if you're in Cleveland on business, you still say I'm from Minnesota. Snowbirds, however, is a big issue. Snowbirds is a big issue. Snowbirds. Why do people leave Minnesota in winter? I mean, besides the obvious. Why would people want to leave Minnesota? Taxes, right? So someone who might live outside of Minnesota because of tax purposes, my aunt and uncle, using them as an example, they live in Orlando, Florida for the winter. And so they said, well, where should I fill out my census form? On April 1, I won't be in Minnesota. The answer is, the standard is actually, where are you usually a resident? I'm like, well, what does that mean? I said, well, okay, so when you go on a cruise and someone says, where are you from? Do you tell them I'm from Orlando, Florida? Or do you say I'm from Little Falls, Minnesota? I said, well, I'm from Minnesota. Exactly. Or do you cheer for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays or the Twins? That's a trick question because no one cheers for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays. So I say follow your heart. It really is a matter of where are you a usual resident, and you can go online if you have questions. If you don't want a flippant answer, you want the real answer, you go to Census's website, and it'll explain all the various situations you can possibly think of, and will tell you where you should be counted.
Here's an interesting question. Indian reservations are sovereign nations. Are persons who live on the reservations counted in our U.S. Census?
Yes, they are. That's a great question. Yes, they are, but they can only be counted by other members from that reservation. So whereas, let's say in Minneapolis, that was where I worked in 2010, so there's the Hawthorne neighborhood, if you're familiar with the Hawthorne neighborhood. So it's just north of Bryn Mawr off of Highway 55. So Hawthorne is here, Bryn Mawr is here. If the Census Bureau couldn't find enough census workers in the Hawthorne neighborhood, they go one block, one census tract north, one east, one west, one south to try to find enough workers. Well, if they couldn't find enough people in Hawthorne, then you could just say, okay, well, we'll just bring people in from Bryn Mawr. Now, you can argue the advisability of that, but that's how those rules work. But in the case of an Indian reservation, they cannot simply say, oh, okay, well, let's just go outside of Mille Lacs and let's go to the next town over, because those people are not permitted to go to Mille Lacs to do the work. So you have to hire from within Mille Lacs in order to count Mille Lacs. And so that's also very challenging. You also have a situation where, speaking with my friends who work with the Native American population, who are themselves Native, say, well, of course, you have the problem where, sometimes someone might spend time on the reservation, sometimes they're staying time in the city. Where do they get counted, right? So that's yet another reason why I don't sleep at night.
What factors were considered in moving to an online census? In other words, why go online? And a corollary to that is the counting technology open to hacking?
More reasons I don't sleep. Actually, so I think the main driver for why they wanted to go online was because it was cost. So I remember back in 2010, they said that if you would fill out your form and mail it in by yourself, the cost to the government was something like $1. Right? That's what it costs for them to print the form, for them to provide you the the self-returning envelope, whatever, the postage paid envelope, and then you put it in the mail and you send it back. If, however, they had to send someone to your door to collect that information, that number went up to $30 or $40. So I think the thought was, by going online, that it'll be even cheaper still. If they send you the postcard, then you go to the URL, you fill that information out, you send it in. Now they don't have to either send you the mailing, you don't have to send it back, and they also then don't have to send someone to your door to collect the information. As to the other question about hacking, I'll just say the Census Bureau does take that very, very seriously, and does, I think, a really good job of protecting data. I also would say that census data, as we talked about some of those questions that are on the form, are themselves not really all that personal. Doesn't ask you what's your social security number, what's your maiden name, basically all the information someone needs in order to be able to open a bank account or open a credit charge or something. I would say yeah, most of the information that you can get on a census form is information you could observe simply by watching me enter and exit my apartment. So while identity theft is a very serious thing, I'm much less concerned about that data being compromised in the context of the census, because there's not much actionable information that you can use to then say run out and go buy a car with. Great. You know, I'm 44 years old. Good job. Cool. An identity thief is more likely to go into someone's mailbox than they are to try to find out what answers you provide in your census form.
Now, there are two questions that you maybe already have answered, but just to clarify, is your name a required question in addition to the number of people, ages, and sexes of the people living in a particular area? And if you skip a question, such as name, is the rest of the information on the form recorded and counted?
So great question. Actually, in 2010, the name was not a required field. And I think it was because the form can be completed not only by the person who lives at that address, but by a proxy, by a neighbor. And the neighbor might not know what your name is, although they might be able to answer more questions. So, and if you don't answer the name or any of the other non-required questions, that form could still be considered complete. Although the Census Bureau may still continue to come back to the home to try to help complete more of the form itself would be considered complete, and after the requisite number of attempts the Census Bureau is allowed, had you in 2010 answered number of people, age, and sex, that form itself would have been considered complete.
And then two questions that are very similar. If you lose your form, can you get a second one? And what do you do if no one answers or does not fill out a form that arrives at their house at all?
So to the first question, if you lose your form, trust me, the census will send you another one. And if you don't answer that, they'll send someone to your door to help you fill it out. That's one. And I'm sorry, the second question again?
What if no one fills it out at all?
So if you don't answer the questions at all, then the Census Bureau will send someone to your door, and they may knock up to 5 or 6 times trying to get that information. After, I think, 3 attempts, then they'll start asking neighbors for that information. But after that, I believe it's 6th attempt, if they haven't gathered any of that information, either from the person who lives at that address or any of their neighbors, then the household gets marked as a 0.
What is Minnesota doing to get counts of people speaking languages that are not supported by the U.S. Census form, such as the Hmong, Somali, and I believe you use the term Romo, which I personally don't know what language that is.
Oromo, yeah. Yeah, so what our office is doing is we work with a coalition called the Minnesota Census Mobilization Project. It's a partnership, rather. And it's a coalition of nonprofits and and other organizations, many of whom have ties to those very communities. And so we've been banging the drum pretty hard about jobs for the last year, and our partners are telling their people about those jobs as well. So it is our hope that the word is getting out to those very same communities, the East African, West African, to the Korean community, to the Tibetans, to whomever, who are A, likely to be missed, and also B, speak a language that is not supported by the Census Bureau, in the hopes that even if the Census Bureau does not provide a Somali census form, that a Somali speaker can come to the door and live translate the information. What the Census Bureau workers do, what the Census Bureau enumerators have, is it's a laminated sheet, and it's got like 53 languages on it. It's 2-sided. And essentially in 53 languages it says, I'm from the Census Bureau. Which language do you speak? And so if you're not able to communicate with the person at the door, you hold this sheet up and they're kind of looking, boom, and you write down number 27, whatever that was. And then you go back to the office and you look it up and like, does anyone speak Hungarian? Or does anyone speak Romanian or whatever 27 was? And then the Census Bureau will try to send someone that can do that. Now keep in mind, Census Bureau employees, only Census Bureau employees can go to the homes to ask the questions. So a Census Bureau employee can't, like a family member could help them out or a neighbor could help them out if they wanted them to, but you can't just come to the door with a random person like, oh, you speak Hungarian, here, come with me. Let's gather your neighbor's personal information together. We're going to fill this out. So it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. One which I hope we're up to.
On the topic of personal information, the question is, wasn't date of birth one of the questions? And if that's a personal question, how's that protected?
Yeah, so it is a question. It is a question on the form, but it's not a mandatory question. So you don't have to provide that information if you don't care to. There's also a question on there. It asks you for a phone number. And interestingly, the reason they ask that question is in case they're not able to read your handwriting. Then someone can call and say, yeah, so is this Andrew? Yeah, we had some problems reading your form. And then they're able to still gather that information. So that's why they answer. But a phone number is also not a mandatory field on the question.
Within the county or city, the complete count committees, what department or office or group has jurisdiction over the complete count committee?
That's a great question. I have no idea. I mean, because it's different for every city and county. We don't have any jurisdiction, we the state. I can't tell Edina, you must set up a complete count committee and this is the person who will do it. Sometimes it's within the Community Development Department. Oftentimes it'll be within the Human Rights Commission. It could be elected officials, it could be non-elected officials. You know, when you're talking like the city of Edina, it tends to originate from the city, the highest elected person. So the mayor may appoint that committee or be on the committee themselves. But you know, we the state, we don't get to decide who represents Edina. We don't get to decide who represents Hennepin County, nor do we get to determine whether they're doing it right or not. Our office's job is to try to provide support for them via training, via monthly conference calls, via our newsletters, in order to help them hone their approach or technique or what have you. But ultimately, it's not our place to tell Edina if they're doing it incorrectly. Or to tell them that someone else should be running it.
In Edina, the city manager, Scott Neal, is in charge of the complete count committee.
That's great. Yeah, and I'll tell you, I'm very impressed with how seriously Edina is taking this. I really, really am. I think I'm the third person, or this is the third presentation in Edina in probably the last 5 weeks about the census. And I think that's terrific. I think that's great. And I wish, well, I mean, except for my time, I wish that all communities took it that seriously. I think it's great.
And one last question. Who counts expats? Are persons who are in the armed services and serving overseas part of the count? And if you work for the U.S. government, say an embassy, et cetera, and you're overseas, are you part of the count?
Correct. Yes. So if you are on assignment from the U.S. government, whether you're in the military or whether you're in a diplomatic mission, you are counted in the census count in the United States. If, however, you are a business person in Paris for the year when the census happens to be, you're not counted by the census. So this is not like overseas voting where you retain your right to continue to vote even though you're living overseas. So yeah, that's an interesting situation. There's a group, I won't say where they're from, but there's a group who was upset that that was my answer, or that is the answer from the Census Bureau. And they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. I said, well, I'm sorry, but that is nevertheless the way how it is. I think, my experience in working on the 2010 census is that whatever the blind spots that the census may have, that they want them to be the same for all 50 states, right? So they don't want there to be any differentiation, say, between Minneapolis and St. Paul, or the Twin Cities in Duluth, Minnesota, or Duluth, Minnesota and Duluth, Georgia. So it can sometimes be frustrating because you say, well, yeah, but we have a large Somali population. Why don't we translate Somali? And they say, well, because this is how it's done. Because every place has a language or languages which aren't supported, and so that's kind of the evening out point, which is also the reason why I'm doing the job that I'm doing now and who I'm working for. I don't work for the Census Bureau. I work for the state of Minnesota. So while the Census Bureau may have a regulation to say, well, there can be no differentiation between Minnesota and Wisconsin, I certainly know there's a difference, and I'm doing what I can in order to make sure that Minnesota does do things different than Wisconsin and does it better than Wisconsin, so we get a better count than Wisconsin and the other 49 states as well.
Those are all the questions that were submitted. I don't know if we've got a little time, if someone just thought of something they want to ask.
Yes, sir.
If we redraw the congressional districts, what is the process to do that?
That's a great question. So it varies from state to state. In Minnesota, it's actually done by I think it's a 3-judge panel. And that's been the case for 30 years, 40 years,
They never
I
can
think.
decide, so it ends up. Exactly.
That's true. That's true.
They can't get together, then the other,
That's true.
then it's a panel.
That's true. In Minnesota, both political parties submit their preferred maps, and then it ends up going to a judge panel. Other states, that's not the case. Other states where it's simply whoever's in control of the legislature at the time of the census then gets to draw the districts, and oftentimes draws it in order to favor the particular jersey that they're wearing. Fortunately, that's not the case in Minnesota. Originally by accident and now by custom. Although, yeah, it's an interesting one. Anybody else?
I would like to go back to your question, or to the question about residency and snowbirds. Is not the standard that someone has to live in a state for 6 months plus a day? So wouldn't the census residency requirement be the same?
No, because not all snowbirds live somewhere for 6 months and 6 months in a day. They might only live in a different state for 4 months, and one of those months might include April 1st, right? So when you get your census form, it's non-forwardable mail. So if you, let's say you're in Sun City, Arizona, you're from Edina, your form is waiting for you in Edina, but that form can't be forwarded, and then you get the form in Sun City, Arizona, and you get a chance to fill it out. The message I want to impart to those who are in that particular situation is when you get the form in Sun City, Arizona, if you spend the majority of your time here in Minnesota, fill out your forms. I'm a Minnesotan, right? But yes, in the situation that you're referring to, if a person lived in Sun City, Arizona for 6 months and 1 day, yes, then they should fill out their form to say, I live in Arizona. Yep.
Did they at one time ask the respondent to fill it out for where they were on April 1st?
Yeah. Yeah.
that's no
So
longer the
it's
case?
it's still based on April 1st, but the actual standard is where do you spend the majority of your time? So, you know, again, the businessman, the business person in Cleveland, Ohio for the night, if they happen to be there 379 days from now, they don't say, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. They say, I'm from Minnesota, or I'm from wherever they generally live. But that speaks to the challenge of how hard it is to get a fair and accurate count the further away you get from April 1st. So my territory in 2010, I had Dinkytown. Well, my enumerator started hitting the ground on or about the third week of April. Well, we only had basically till the first week of May before all the kids all went home for the summer. And so if my enumerator showed up on May 15th at this house and says, you know, as the kids are moving, they're like, you know, it's like sofa or kegerator or whatever into the place, you're like, hey, were you guys here on April 1? No. Do you know who was? No. Okay, great, good talk. And then you asked all the other neighbors, and they're like, yeah, we just got here too, right? So that speaks to the challenge. So the further away we get from April 1st, the harder it is to get that, all right, but where were you on that particular day? Or was that house empty then? Or did you fill out your form at your old residence before you moved here, right? And that's where things get a little weird.
Is there a last date that you can collect the information? Like if the count is supposed to be April 1st, presumably you get your form March 15th. Is there a final date if you don't get around to filling it out until June 1st? Can you still send it in and be counted?
Yeah, I can't give you a date certain. I can tell you that non-response follow-up goes for a period of months, and then they'll continue to send enumerators out to that point. I'm trying to remember, I believe it was sometime in July, was in 2010. I'm not sure what it'll be this time. So this is not a matter of you must get your form in a week, you know, right after April 1st, but the sooner you can get it in, the less the more likely you are to fill it out, and the less time and money is going to be spent trying to chase you down in order to be able to get that form completed. Great.
Andrew, thank you very much
Thank you.
for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And I hope everyone takes something away from this that they can use, and talk to your friends and neighbors. Probably you don't need to start talking to them just yet. I mean, it's a year away, but it's important to just kind of keep that conversation, especially a year from now, so they know how critical it is. Thank you so much.